She saved wild rabbits from a fire. What they did next shocked everyone. The morning sun painted Montana's Bitterroot Valley in shades of amber and gold. But Sarah Coleman barely noticed the beauty around her. At 48, she stood at her kitchen window, coffee cup clutched in trembling hands, staring at the letter she'd received yesterday. After 23 years, the privately owned wildlife sanctuary where she worked was facing closure due to financial difficulties. The news felt like a physical blow, threatening not just her livelihood but her entire way of life. Sarah had never fit neatly into the human world. Her childhood in rural Montana had been marked by an almost supernatural connection to animals. A gift, her grandmother called it. A peculiarity, according to her more practical parents. Now, as she watched a family of eastern cottontails emerge from the morning mist to feed in her backyard, she wondered if she'd spent too much of her life choosing animals over people. The 5 acres behind her modest ranch house had become a testament to that choice. Over the years, she transformed the land into a private wildlife haven, carefully cultivating native plants and creating microhabitats for local species. The property bordered the vast Bitterroot National Forest, making it a natural corridor for wildlife seeking refuge from the encroaching development in the valley. Among her wild neighbors, the rabbits held a special place in her heart. She'd been observing the same family groups for 3 generations now, documenting their behaviors and social structures. There was one rabbit in particular, a female she'd named Mama Rose, who had captured her attention. The rabbit bore a distinctive marking, a darker patch of fur above her right eye that resembled a beauty mark, making her easily identifiable among her kin. "You're looking mighty pleased with yourself this morning, Rose?" Sarah murmured, watching the rabbit confidently lead her 3 kits to a patch of clover she'd specifically planted for them. The young ones were growing quickly, their fur transitioning from the downy softness of infancy to the sleeker coat of adolescence. The sound of a truck rumbling up her gravel driveway broke the morning quiet. Sarah recognized the familiar rattle of her brother Mike's old Ford before she saw it round the bend. As the local fire chief, Mike rarely made social calls this early in the morning. The crease between his brows as he stepped out of the truck confirmed her suspicion that this wasn't a casual visit. "Morning, sis," he called out, making his way to her back porch. At 52, Mike Coleman carried his years well, though the responsibilities of his job had added strands of silver to his dark hair. "Got a minute?" Sarah held up her coffee cup in invitation, and Mike followed her into the kitchen. He declined her offer of coffee, instead pulling out a map from his back pocket and spreading it across her worn oak table. "We've got trouble brewing," he said, pointing to an area west of her property. "This drought's turned the whole forest into a tinderbox. We've had 3 small fires in the past week, all from lightning strikes. The forecast is calling for more dry lightning tonight, and the wind patterns." He trailed off, his finger tracing a path that led directly to her sanctuary. Sarah felt her throat tighten. "How bad?" "Bad enough that I want you to pack an emergency bag. If a fire starts up in these conditions, it'll move fast. Too fast, maybe, for a proper evacuation." He met her eyes. "I know you, Sarah. Promise me you won't try to be a hero if things go south." She nodded absently, her mind already racing through contingency plans for the wildlife that depended on her sanctuary. Mike recognized the look in her eyes and sighed. "I mean it, Sarah. No risks. Mom and Dad didn't leave us this land so you could get yourself killed trying to save every creature in Montana. Their parents had died 5 years ago in a car accident, leaving the siblings the family property. Mike had sold his share to Sarah, understanding her need to protect the land. It was a decision he occasionally questioned, especially when his sister's dedication to wildlife veered toward the dangerous. After Mike left, Sarah spent the morning preparing. She set up sprinklers around the property, filled extra water containers, and checked the emergency supplies in her basement. But her heart grew heavier with each passing hour as she watched the wildlife going about their normal routines, unaware of the potential danger. By late afternoon, the air had taken on an oppressive quality. The temperature had climbed to 98 degrees, and the wind was picking up, carrying with it the scent of distant smoke. Sarah's phone buzzed with a weather alert, Severe thunderstorm warning, conditions favorable for dry lightning. She was about to head inside when she noticed Mama Rose acting strangely. The rabbit was repeatedly hopping to a specific spot near the western edge of the property, then returning to her kits, as if trying to lead them somewhere. Sarah had documented similar behavior before. Rabbits sometimes moved their young to new locations if they sensed danger. Using her binoculars, Sarah followed Mama Rose's path and spotted something that made her heart sink. A new warren, recently dug, right in the area Mike had identified as highest risk if a fire broke out. At least 3 rabbit families had relocated there, possibly attracted by the soft soil and natural coverage. The first lightning bolt split the sky just after sunset, followed by a rumble of thunder that seemed to shake the earth. Sarah stood on her back porch, counting the seconds between flash and boom, calculating the storm's distance. The air crackled with electricity, but no rain fell, the worst possible conditions. She was about to head inside when she saw it. A bright flash followed immediately by a distant orange glow. Her phone rang seconds later. "Sarah, we've got a fire." Mike's voice was tense. "It's moving fast, heading northeast. You need to evacuate now." But Sarah was already running toward her garden shed. "The warren, Mike. There's a new warren on the western edge. At least 3 families of rabbits." "I can't." "Damn it, Sarah, no. The fire's moving too fast. Get out of there." She ended the call, knowing she'd pay for it later but unable to do anything else. The garden hose was already connected and running at full pressure, part of her preparation from the morning. She grabbed it along with a spray bottle filled with water and her heavy canvas work coat. The wind had picked up considerably, driving the flames faster than anyone had anticipated. The western sky had transformed into a wall of orange, and she could hear the fire's approach, a roar like a freight train bearing down on her sanctuary. Sarah reached the warren just as the first embers began to rain down around her. The rabbits were in panic mode, darting back and forth in confusion as their escape routes disappeared behind curtains of smoke and flame. She counted at least 7 adults and numerous young ones, including Mama Rose and her kits. Using the garden hose, she created a protective arc of wet ground around the warren entrance. The rabbits, driven by desperation, began to gather in the small safe zone she'd created. Under normal circumstances, wild rabbits would never cluster so close to a human, but these were not normal circumstances. The heat was becoming unbearable, and the smoke burned her eyes and throat. Sarah knew she had minutes, maybe seconds, before the fire would overtake them completely. In a move that would later be described as either insane or inspired, she began to remove her coat. "Come on," she coughed, spreading the coat on the ground. "Please trust me just this once." What happened next would be debated in wildlife behavior circles for years to come. The rabbits, led by Mama Rose, began to hop onto the coat. Sarah carefully gathered the edges, creating a makeshift carrier. She counted 11 rabbits in total, 4 adults including Mama Rose, and 7 young ones. The journey back to her house was a nightmare of smoke, heat, and the precious weight of frightened animals in her arms. Twice she stumbled, but the rabbits remained still, as if understanding that their survival depended on this strange partnership. She had just reached her back porch when the first fire truck arrived, sirens wailing. Mike jumped out before the vehicle had fully stopped, his face a mask of fury and relief. "Inside, now!" he shouted, already directing his crew to protect the house. Sarah gently placed her coat full of rabbits in a large dog kennel she kept for wildlife emergencies. As she provided them with water and some fresh vegetables, she could hear the firefighters battling to save her home. The rabbits huddled together, their sides heaving with rapid breaths, but otherwise remarkably calm. The fight to save Sarah's property lasted through the night. By dawn, the immediate danger had passed, though much of her sanctuary lay scorched and smoking. The fire had been contained just yards from her house, thanks to the tireless efforts of Mike's crew and a fortunate shift in the wind. As the sun rose over the devastated landscape, Sarah sat on her back porch, exhausted and smoke-stained, watching Mama Rose and her companions in the kennel. Mike approached, looking equally worn. "That was quite a risk you took," he said quietly. Sarah nodded, too tired to argue. "I couldn't let them die, Mike. Not when I could do something about it." Her brother was silent for a long moment. "You know, I always thought your connection with animals was just, I don't know, a phase you never grew out of. But last night, when I saw you coming out of that smoke with those rabbits..." He shook his head. "Maybe there's something to this gift of yours after all." The local news picked up the story, and despite Sarah's reluctance, she found herself in the spotlight. The headline, "Local Wildlife Specialist Braves Fire to Save Wild Rabbits," sparked interest beyond their small community. Researchers and wildlife experts began reaching out, intrigued by the unusual behavior of the rabbits during the rescue. But it was what happened next that truly captured the world's attention. Sarah had planned to release the rabbits in a safe area once they had recovered from their ordeal. She chose a location on the eastern part of her property, unaffected by the fire and rich with natural coverage and food sources. However, when she opened the kennel door, expecting them to bolt for freedom, something extraordinary happened. The rabbits emerged cautiously, with Mama Rose in the lead, but they didn't leave the area. Instead, they began to explore the immediate vicinity of Sarah's house, eventually establishing a new warren less than 50 feet from her back porch. An unprecedented choice for wild rabbits. Dr. Elena Martinez, a renowned wildlife behaviorist from the University of Montana, arrived to study the phenomenon. "What we're observing here," she explained, "is a remarkable adaptation in wildlife behavior. These rabbits appear to have formed a sophisticated understanding of human intervention and safety, while maintaining their essential wild nature." The rabbits' unusual behavior continued to evolve. They began to display complex social interactions not just with each other, but in relation to human presence. Mama Rose, in particular, seemed to have appointed herself as an ambassador between the two species. One morning, about 2 weeks after the fire, Sarah discovered something extraordinary. Mama Rose was sitting on her back porch, waiting. When Sarah appeared, the rabbit hopped a short distance away, then looked back expectantly. Intrigued, Sarah followed at a distance. Mama Rose led her to a shallow depression beneath a serviceberry bush, where 3 tiny kits lay nested in soft grass and fur. The rabbit had chosen to have her new litter virtually in Sarah's backyard, displaying a level of trust that defied conventional understanding of wildlife behavior. The story took an even more remarkable turn when other animals began to appear. Word seemed to spread through the wildlife community that Sarah's property was a safe haven. Dr. Martinez documented how the rescued rabbits appeared to be teaching newcomers about the security of the area, leading them to food sources and showing them the best places for burrows. News of the unusual rabbit behavior reached Dr. James Morrison, head of the Wildlife Conservation Department at Montana State University. His arrival at Sarah's property coincided with another extraordinary development in the story. A young red-tailed hawk, injured in the fire, had taken refuge in a low branch near Sarah's house. Instead of their usual terror of the predator, the rabbits seemed to recognize its injured state. They maintained a respectful distance but continued their daily activities nearby, demonstrating an unprecedented level of adaptation. Dr. Morrison was fascinated. "What we're witnessing here," he noted, "is evidence of behavioral plasticity in wildlife that goes beyond our current understanding. These animals aren't just surviving. They're actively adapting their social structures and responses to create new patterns of coexistence." The story caught the attention of a documentary filmmaker, Rebecca Chin, who arrived to capture the unique relationship between Sarah and the wildlife on her property. During filming, she discovered another layer to the story: the imminent closure of the wildlife sanctuary where Sarah worked. "Here's this woman who has demonstrated an extraordinary ability to connect with and help wildlife," Chan observed, "and she's about to lose her ability to do that work professionally." It seemed like a tragedy in the making. But the publicity surrounding the rabbit rescue had unexpected consequences. As Chen's documentary gained traction on social media, donations began pouring in to save the wildlife sanctuary. A wealthy conservation advocate, moved by Sarah's dedication and the remarkable behavior of the rabbits, offered to establish an endowment to keep the sanctuary operating in perpetuity. Sarah found herself in a position she'd never expected, at the forefront of changing attitudes about wildlife conservation and human-animal relationships. The rabbit story challenged traditional views about maintaining distance from wildlife, suggesting that there might be a middle ground between complete separation and harmful habituation. As winter approached, Sarah worried about how the rabbit community would handle the harsh Montana weather, especially with much of their natural habitat destroyed by the fire. Once again, the animals surprised everyone with their adaptability. The rabbit families worked together to create an elaborate system of burrows, incorporating natural features and man-made structures in ways that showed remarkable problem-solving abilities. They used brush piles Sarah had created, but also engineered their own solutions, creating windbreaks from fallen branches and utilizing the landscape in sophisticated ways. Dr. Martinez continued her observation of the population, documenting fascinating insights about wildlife resilience and adaptation. What we're seeing here isn't just survival behavior, she noted in her research papers. It's the emergence of new social structures in response to environmental challenges. These rabbits are demonstrating that wildlife can adapt their behavior significantly while maintaining their wild nature, challenging our understanding of the boundaries between wild and human-habituated animals. The fire that had nearly destroyed Sarah's sanctuary had, ironically, created something even more remarkable: a living laboratory of wildlife adaptation and human-animal cooperation. The rabbits maintained their independence while demonstrating that wild creatures could form complex relationships with humans without losing their essential nature. 1 year after the fire, Sarah's property had become a model for wildlife conservation and rehabilitation. The burned area had regenerated, now supporting an even more diverse ecosystem than before. The rabbit population had stabilized at a sustainable level, with different family groups maintaining distinct territories while sharing resources in ways that defied previous understanding of the species' behavior. Mama Rose remained a constant presence, now the matriarch of a thriving community. Her original beauty mark had faded somewhat with age, but her descendants could often be identified by similar markings, a living reminder of the night that had changed everything. She still made regular appearances on Sarah's porch, especially in the early mornings, maintaining the extraordinary connection that had begun in those desperate moments during the fire. The success of Chen's documentary led to increased interest in wildlife conservation and rehabilitation. Sarah found herself invited to speak at conferences and universities, sharing her experiences and insights. She remained humble, always emphasizing that her situation was unique, the result of extreme circumstances, and that wild animals should generally be left alone unless they're in immediate danger. The wildlife sanctuary where she worked not only survived but thrived, expanding its programs and becoming a leading center for research into wildlife behavior and conservation. Sarah developed new protocols for wildlife rehabilitation that took into account the possibility of more complex relationships between humans and animals, while still maintaining appropriate boundaries. Mike, who had initially been skeptical of his sister's deep connection with wildlife, became one of her strongest advocates. The fire department developed new protocols for handling wildlife during natural disasters, and Mike often consulted with Sarah on wildlife-related emergency responses. The local community's attitude toward wildlife underwent a dramatic shift. People who had previously seen wild animals as nuisances or threats began to view them as intelligent beings capable of complex social behaviors, and even a form of reciprocal relationship with humans. Sarah's property became an informal education center, hosting school groups and researchers interested in studying the unique dynamics between humans and wildlife. The rabbits continued to surprise and delight observers with their behavior. They maintained their wild nature while demonstrating remarkable adaptability and social intelligence. New generations were born, inheriting both their parents' unusual comfort with human presence and their essential wildness. Dr. Morrison's continued research led to publications that challenged traditional views about wildlife rehabilitation and human-animal relationships. What we've learned here, he wrote, suggests that we need to reevaluate our assumptions about wildlife behavior and adaptation. These animals have shown us that there's room for a new model of conservation, one that recognizes the potential for meaningful coexistence between humans and wildlife. As Sarah watched the sun rise over her property each morning, often with Mama Rose and her descendants nearby, She reflected on how a moment of crisis had led to such profound changes. The fire that had threatened to destroy everything had instead created something beautiful, a living testament to the resilience of both wildlife and the human spirit. 2 years after the fire, Sarah's work attracted the attention of the National Wildlife Federation. They were particularly interested in how the rabbit community had not only survived but thrived in close proximity to human activity while maintaining their wild behaviors. What made the situation even more remarkable was how the original group's adaptations had influenced newer generations and even other species. One crisp autumn morning, Sarah noticed something unprecedented. A young deer, injured and frightened, had wandered onto her property. Instead of fleeing, the rabbit community, led by one of Mama Rose's offspring, exhibited what could only be described as guiding behavior. The rabbits created a path of movement that led the deer to a sheltered area near Sarah's house, where she could safely approach and treat its wounds. Dr. Martinez, who happened to be on site that day, was astounded. "This goes beyond simple adaptation," she noted in her journal. "These rabbits appear to have developed a sophisticated understanding of human assistance and are actively facilitating it for other species. It's as if they've become intermediaries between the wild and human worlds." The story took another remarkable turn when a severe winter storm hit the region in December of that year. The temperature dropped to record lows, and heavy snow blanketed the area. Sarah worried about how the wildlife would cope, but once again the rabbits demonstrated extraordinary behavior. The warren system they'd developed had become increasingly sophisticated, with multiple entrances and emergency exits. During the storm, Sarah observed rabbits leading smaller wildlife, field mice, voles, and even a young raccoon, into their burrow system. They were sharing their shelter with other species, demonstrating a level of altruistic behavior rarely documented in wildlife. "What we're seeing here," Dr. Morrison explained to a fascinated group of graduate students, "is the evolution of interspecies cooperation triggered by a traumatic event, the fire, and sustained by positive human interaction. It's rewriting our understanding of wildlife adaptation and social learning." Mama Rose, now entering her later years, had become something of a legend in wildlife research circles. Her distinctive marking had been passed down to many of her descendants, creating what researchers called the Rose lineage, a family line of rabbits that exhibited extraordinary social intelligence and adaptive behaviors while maintaining their wild nature. The impact of Sarah's work and the rabbit story extended far beyond her small corner of Montana. Conservation groups around the world began studying her methods and the unique dynamics that had developed on her property. The documentary about her story, titled "The Fire That Changed Everything," won several awards and inspired a new generation of wildlife conservationists. Sarah established the Coleman Wildlife Education Center on her property, using the endowment funds to create programs that taught responsible wildlife interaction and conservation. She was careful to emphasize that her situation was unique, born of extreme circumstances and years of dedicated work, while teaching principles that could be applied more broadly to wildlife conservation. Mike, who had once worried about his sister's dedication to wildlife, now brought his grandchildren to learn from her. "My sister," he would tell them, "showed us that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is trust your instincts about helping others, even when everyone else thinks you're crazy." The burned area of the property had transformed into something even more remarkable than before. Native plants had returned in force, creating a diverse ecosystem that supported more species than ever. The rabbits had played a crucial role in this regeneration, their grazing patterns and burrowing activities helping to distribute seeds and create microhabitats for other species. As Sarah approached her 50th birthday, she received news that would bring her story full circle. The University of Montana wanted to establish a permanent research station on her property, dedicated to studying wildlife behavior and human-animal relationships. The proposal would ensure that her work would continue long after she was gone, providing opportunities for future generations to learn from the remarkable community she'd helped create. One morning, as she sat on her porch watching the sunrise, Sarah noticed something that brought tears to her eyes. Mama Rose, now elderly for a wild rabbit, had emerged from her burrow with what would be her last litter. The elderly rabbit made her way slowly to the porch, her beauty mark still visible though faded with age. and settled down next to Sarah's chair, something she'd never done before. As the sun rose higher, other rabbits emerged from their warrens, including several generations of Mama Rose's descendants. They created a circle around the porch, each maintaining their wild independence while acknowledging the extraordinary bond that had developed between their species. Dr. Martinez, who happened to be visiting that week, witnessed the scene. "In all my years of studying wildlife," she would later write, "I've never seen anything quite like this. It wasn't domestication or even habituation. It was something entirely new. A kind of cooperative relationship between species that maintained the dignity and independence of both while acknowledging their capacity to help and learn from each other." Mama Rose passed away peacefully that winter, but her legacy lived on in the thriving community she'd helped establish. Her descendants continued to exhibit the remarkable behaviors she'd pioneered, passing them on to new generations and even teaching them to rabbits from outside the community. The story of Sarah and the rabbits became more than just a tale of rescue. It became a symbol of hope for the future of wildlife conservation. It demonstrated that with patience, respect, and understanding, humans and wildlife could find ways to coexist that benefited both while preserving the essential wildness that made each species unique. Sarah's property became known as the Rose Sanctuary, named not just for Mama Rose but for the blossoming of new understanding that had occurred there. It stood as a living testament to the possibility of meaningful connection between humans and wildlife, proving that sometimes the most powerful changes come not from trying to control nature, but from being willing to learn and grow alongside it. As she watched new generations of rabbits teaching their young the complex social behaviors that had developed since the fire, Sarah reflected on how a moment of crisis had led to such profound change. The fire that had threatened to destroy everything had instead sparked a transformation in how humans and wildlife could interact, creating ripples of change that would continue long into the future. "The most shocking thing," Sarah would often say to visitors, "wasn't that I saved the rabbits from the fire. It was that in doing so, we all learned something profound about the capacity for adaptation, trust, and cooperation between species. Sometimes it takes a crisis to show us what's possible when we open our hearts to new ways of thinking about our relationship with the natural world." And so the story continues, with each new generation of rabbits and humans learning from and building upon the extraordinary legacy that began on that fateful night when a woman chose to risk everything to save a family of wild rabbits from a fire, never imagining that her act of compassion would lead to such profound and lasting change.